The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, pale gray beneath a sky that couldn't decide between sunshine and storm. I had been driving since dawn, the kind of long drive that makes you feel both restless and numb at the same time. In the back seat, wrapped in layers of linen, sat a wooden keepsake box, something my father once carved with his own hands. Inside it, I'd placed a pair of silver candlesticks that had passed from my grandmother to me. Tonight, I planned to give them to Darius as a gesture of blessing for his engagement. My brother's house was 12 hours away, but I told myself the distance was nothing compared to the years we had once shared. When we were children, there had been no miles between us. I remembered sitting on the banks of Pine River with fishing poles too big for our hands, daring each other to catch the first perch. Darius always cheated, tugging his line to pretend he had a bite, and I would laugh until my sides ached. Somewhere between Illinois farmland and Missouri hills, the memories kept me company. We had whispered secrets beneath quilted forts, invented stories on long car rides, and leaned on each other when our parents fought in the kitchen. I thought about those nights when Darius would sneak into my room after a nightmare, insisting he wasn't scared, only bored. That was the boy I wanted to see again, the one I was willing to drive half a day for. The hours grew heavier as the road narrowed into smaller towns. Gas stations blurred together, coffee cups stacked on the passenger seat. My shoulders ached, but my chest carried a stubborn hope. Whatever distance time had built between us, I believed this dinner could be a bridge. An engagement was more than a milestone. It was the start of a new family, a chance to remember the old bonds that mattered. When I finally crossed into his city, the sky had gone soft and gray, the kind that held its breath before rain. I adjusted the keepsake box on the seat beside me and whispered to myself, as if the candlesticks could hear, "This is worth it." By the time I turned onto Darius's street, I felt the weight of exhaustion mingling with anticipation, both pressing against my ribs as I pulled into his driveway. The neighborhood was quiet when I pulled into the driveway, the kind of place where every lawn looked clipped to the same length, where porches carried identical wreaths. Darius's house stood taller than I expected, all clean lines and sharp angles, nothing like the home we grew up in. I sat for a moment with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, telling myself the long drive had been worth it. The wooden keepsake box felt heavier when I lifted it from the seat. I straightened my shoulders, walked up the steps, and knocked. For a few seconds, I heard nothing but the faint sound of laughter from inside. Then the door swung open. Maribel stood there, her hand still on the knob, eyes widening just enough to betray surprise before settling into something cooler. She looked past me, as if checking whether anyone else was there, then back at the box in my arms. "I brought something for the engagement dinner," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. She tilted her head, lips curving into a thin smile. "Oh," she said lightly, "they had the dinner yesterday." Her words landed like stones, each one sinking deeper. I blinked, thinking I must have misheard. "Yesterday. Just close family," she added, almost as an afterthought, though her eyes didn't waver from mine. The box pressed into my arms until it seemed to burn. Behind her, I caught the sound of glasses clinking, chairs scraping, the hum of people I wasn't meant to see. I stood frozen, the threshold between us more solid than any wall. Maribel's smile didn't change, but she didn't move aside either. For a moment, I thought Darius might appear behind her, that he would laugh and say it was all a mix-up. But the seconds stretched, and no one came. Maribel shifted her weight and said, almost politely, "Maybe another time." Then the door closed. Quiet and final, leaving me alone on the porch with nothing but the weight in my arms and the echo of voices that no longer included mine. I sat back in the driver's seat, the keepsake box on the passenger side like an accusation I couldn't look away from. My arms still ached from holding it on the porch. waiting for a welcome that never came. The porch light glowed behind me, but no one opened the door again. No voice called my name. Only laughter drifted faintly through the walls, muffled and distant, as though I had already been erased from the picture. I stared at my phone, half expecting a message from Darius, some hurried explanation or at least an apology. Nothing. The screen stayed dark, the silence heavier than words could ever be. My mind began to turn through the years, unspooling small moments I had folded away the birthday I drove hours to surprise him, only to find he had gone camping with Maribel's family. The calls he promised to return but never did. The weekend I covered a bill he swore he'd handle. Each memory came back with the same quiet ending. Me waiting, him absent. I started the engine and pulled away, the sound of tires on gravel filling the space where conversation should have been. The streets blurred into sameness, houses trimmed in perfect symmetry, families gathered behind curtains. Each lighted window was a reminder of where I didn't belong. By the time I reached the edge of town, the highway stretched out like a dark ribbon, leading me nowhere in particular. I couldn't face the long drive home that night, not with the box still unopened beside me. I pulled into a roadside motel, its neon sign buzzing weakly against the dusk. Inside the room, the silence stayed with me. I set the box on the table, untouched, and lay back on the stiff mattress. My eyes stayed open, tracing cracks on the ceiling, as old memories pressed against the rejection still raw in my chest. What once had been laughter and secrets between siblings was now only the sound of a door closing, leaving me with nothing but quiet I hadn't chosen. The motel night bled into morning, leaving me restless and hollow. By the time I finally drove back home, the house felt colder than usual, the stillness almost deliberate. I set the keepsake box on the hall table, unable to meet its gaze, and went straight to the drawer I rarely opened. It was a plain wooden drawer in my desk, but I knew exactly what it held: the quiet history of every sacrifice I had made for Darius. The first envelope I pulled out was marked with smudged ink, the loan agreement I had written by hand when he asked for help starting his first business. $12,000 money I had scraped together from savings meant for repairs on my roof. He promised me he'd pay it back within a year. Swore it was the beginning of something solid. That business closed before the ink on his plans had dried, and the repayment never came. Beneath it was another stack of papers, property tax notices stamped in red. The year he called nearly in tears because he and Maribel were about to lose the house in Flagstaff. I wired $27,000 the next morning without hesitation. He said he'd never forget what I did for him, that he'd make it right as soon as they got back on their feet. I never mentioned it again, even as the months turned into years. And then there was the credit card, the one in my name that he carried just for emergencies. The balance had grown and shrunk over time, but the pattern never changed: dinners, flights, things I never asked about. Every month I paid it, telling myself it was easier than starting a fight. I laid the papers across the desk, one by one, the numbers staring back like a tally of misplaced trust. Each promise echoed in my mind. I'll pay you back. I won't forget this. You won't regret it. Yet, here I was, sitting in a quiet house, the drawer open like a confession, the papers blurred in front of me, and for the first time in years, I wondered if my devotion had not only cost me money, but the very respect I thought it had earned. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the documents still spread before me. The numbers no longer looked like help. They looked like chains I had willingly clasped around my own wrists. The thought made my stomach turn. I picked up the credit card and held it in my hand. The plastic felt worn, the edges softened from years of being pulled from his wallet, swiped at counters I'd never see, paying for meals I'd never taste. My name was printed across it, yet it had never really belonged to me. I reached for the phone and dialed the number on the back. The voice on the other end was polite, efficient, asking me to confirm my decision. Yes, I said, steady and clear. Cancel it. Effective immediately. A few keystrokes later, the line went silent, and so did the weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I sat back in the chair, the air around me sharper, freer. For years I had told myself that sacrifice was love, that covering his debts, bailing him out, keeping the card open, all meant I was a good sister. But love twisted into obligation stops looking like love at all. It starts looking like weakness. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to press in on me after Thomas passed. Tonight, it felt different, less hollow, more like space being returned to me. I thought about the years I'd equated devotion with silence, the times I let guilt dictate my choices. Maybe respect had never been missing from him. It had been missing from me. When I finally went to bed, I expected the churn of regret to keep me awake. Instead, I closed my eyes and drifted quickly into sleep, my chest unburdened. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I slept without dreaming of doors shutting in my face. By morning, I woke to a clarity I hadn't known I was capable of carrying. 5 days passed before the phone finally rang. I was trimming the last of the late summer roses in the garden when I saw Darius's name flash across the screen. For a moment, I simply watched it ring, remembering all the times I had called him only to be ignored. This time, I let it buzz twice before I answered. "Elowen," he said, his voice sharp and uneven. "The card doesn't work. Did you forget to pay?" There was no greeting, no pause, just panic pressed into words. I could hear voices in the background, Maribel, urgent and clipped, and the muffled sound of someone knocking, perhaps a vendor at the door. A baby wailed somewhere in the house. Papers shuffled. The edges of his world sounded frayed, unraveling. I tried it 3 times. He continued, breath quick. They said it was declined. "We've got bills here, people waiting. What's going on?" I felt the moment settle over me like a still pond. No racing pulse, no immediate scramble to fix it, just calm. The same card that had once tethered me to his emergencies no longer bound me. "I canceled it," I said quietly. He fell silent, the line crackling between us. Then came the sound of disbelief, the incredulous half-laugh I knew so well. "You what, Elowen? You can't just— How are we supposed to?" I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of cut roses. "It was never supposed to be yours. Darius." His words tumbled, shifting from anger to pleading. "Just until I sort things out. I'll pay you back. I swear this time. Don't leave me hanging like this. Please." But nothing in me stirred to answer that old call. I let the silence expand, filling the space where my fear used to live. He waited, expecting the version of me who always rushed to soften the blow. She was gone. I forgot. I said at last, my tone steady. I must have forgotten, before he could reply. I ended the call. The roses at my feet looked brighter somehow, their petals open to the fading sun, as if they knew a weight had shifted. The calls didn't stop after that first one. Darius rang again within the hour, and then again the next morning. Each time his voice shifted, bending between tones like a man trying on masks. At first, there was anger, the clipped, sharp syllables meant to corner me. Then came reason. His words softened, drawing on the old rhythm of persuasion I'd known since we were children. Finally, desperation. The voice of a boy asking me not to leave him behind. I listened to him cycle through it all, the same way I had listened so many times before. I remembered the way he used to smile when he needed something, how he could weave his charm into guilt until I couldn't tell one from the other. For years it had worked. I had believed in him even when I shouldn't, mistaking his need for closeness as proof of love. But standing in my kitchen now, phone pressed to my ear, I realized the spell was broken. His charm no longer warmed me. It only reminded me of how much I had given away without question. "Elowen," he said again, his voice breaking, "you don't understand what's at stake. Just a little more time." I closed my eyes, letting the quiet stretch between us until his words thinned into static. Then I spoke, soft enough that even I could hear the difference in myself. "Oh, I forgot." The silence that followed was heavier than his anger, sharper than his pleading. Before he could find a reply, I ended the call. The house settled around me, no longer heavy, just still. I stood for a moment with the phone in my hand, feeling the ground steady beneath me in a way it hadn't for years. For once, the choice was mine, and it was not to save him, but to save myself. I set the phone on the counter, turned toward the window, and watched the last light of the day fade into the horizon, knowing the silence between us had shifted into something irreversible. The messages started 2 days later, long strings of words that tried to stitch themselves into excuses. Darius's tone swung wildly, first guilt, then sorrow, then promises lined with familiar desperation. "I never meant to hurt you," one read. Another followed with, "You know I'll pay you back this time. Just don't give up on me." And then, "Family shouldn't turn their back when things get hard." I read each one without replying. The sentences all blurred into the same hollow refrain I had heard for years. They carried weight once, enough to bend me back into silence. Now they sounded thin, like echoes bouncing in an empty room. When I opened my phone to distract myself, Maribel's world appeared bright and polished across the screen. Photos of dinner parties, glasses raised high, her captions full of joy. She tagged Darius in every one, their smiles flawless, their table crowded. There was no sign of bills unpaid, no trace of calls left unanswered, no shadow of the panic I had heard in his voice. It was a performance, as much for themselves as for anyone watching. They could erase me from the story with a smile. Just as they had shut the door in my face, the thought no longer pierced me. It clarified. Their love had never been love without strings. It had been a leash, looped tighter each time I gave. I set the phone down and let the silence return. For the first time, it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like distance I had chosen. The keepsake box still sat untouched on the hallway table, its polished wood catching the afternoon light. I brushed my hand over it and felt no urgency to deliver it anymore. It was mine until I decided otherwise. Outside, the air carried the crisp edge of approaching autumn, and I realized the season was shifting around me as surely as I was shifting within it. The life I had lived at their mercy was closing like a chapter, and something steadier was beginning to take its place. The weeks that followed moved with a quieter rhythm. Without Darius's card charges slipping into my statements, I saw numbers I hadn't seen in years. What had once been swallowed by his debts now belonged to me again, and the shift felt like opening a window in a room I hadn't realized was suffocating. The first choice I made was practical. I sent an extra payment toward my mortgage, watching the balance drop with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with control. Each payment was a small declaration that this house, this roof, was mine because of my effort, not because I had left myself second to someone else's needs. The second choice was for joy. I signed up for an art class at the community center, something I had always postponed because there wasn't money to spare. I walked into that bright room on a Thursday evening, the smell of paint and clay filling the air, and took a seat among strangers who carried their own quiet longings. Holding a brush in my hand again felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had set aside too long. The third choice was for others. I wrote a check to the women's shelter downtown, anonymous and quiet, no need for recognition. I knew what it felt like to give without being seen. But this time it wasn't about being erased. It was about standing with people who deserved to know they weren't alone. Each act was small on its own, but together They felt like a new balance being drawn. What had once been taken without thanks was now building something solid, something that belonged entirely to me. And as autumn deepened, I found myself ready for what came next. The call came late, long after the house had settled into its familiar stillness. Darius's voice was low, heavy with something that might have been regret, though I couldn't be sure. He stumbled through words about mistakes, about pressures I couldn't understand, about wanting to make things right. I let him speak, my silence no longer a cage but a boundary. When he finally paused, waiting for me to soften, I said only that I heard him. I didn't offer more. After we hung up, I walked to the hallway where the keepsake box still rested. For weeks it had sat in plain sight, a reminder of what I had meant to give him, what I had once believed would carry our family's history forward. I lifted it gently, carried it to my study, and opened the cabinet drawer where I kept the things that mattered most. Sliding it inside, I locked the drawer with a small brass key. It no longer felt like a gift withheld. It felt like preservation, waiting for someone who would understand its weight and treat it with the reverence it deserved. I stood there for a moment, hand resting on the drawer, realizing that legacies aren't inherited by blood alone. They are earned by respect, guarded by care, and passed on to those who prove worthy of holding them. For years, I had equated family with obligation, love with sacrifice, silence with loyalty. Now I saw them for what they were, choices I could make differently. And in that realization, I felt the ground beneath me steady. I turned off the light in the study and walked toward the quiet of my room, carrying with me not loss, but a new certainty of what it meant to belong.